Welcome, dear listener. Pull your chair a little closer. The fire is low tonight, and the hour is late. But what I am about to share with you is worth every lost moment of sleep. My name is not important. What is important is the story I carry. A story of clocks and silence and a dead man whose workshop held more secrets than hands on a dial. You see, most murders are simple things. Messy, yes. Tragic, always. But simple. A quarrel, a debt, a passion gone wrong. But this one was different. This was a murder built from time itself, where every clock was stopped, where every minute was a lie, and where one man, small, precise, and perhaps a little vain about his moustaches, saw through it all. His name, of course, was Hercule Poirot, and the question he had to answer was not merely who killed Edmund Garrett, the clockmaker of Whitmore Lane. The question was, when? Stay with us. The clock is already ticking. The discovery. Death in the workshop. The smell reached Constable Higgins before anything else did. It was not the smell of death. Not yet. Not exactly. It was something older than that. Oil, metal, wood shavings worn smooth by decades of careful hands. The particular mustiness of a room that had been sealed against the world for too long, where time itself seemed to have thickened in the air like old syrup. He pushed open the door to Edmund Garrett's workshop on Whitmore Lane at approximately 20 minutes past 9 on a grey Tuesday morning in November, and what he saw stopped him as completely as if someone had reached into his chest and stilled his own heart. Every clock in the room was stopped. Not wound down, stopped. There is a difference, and Constable Higgins, who was not an imaginative man by any measure, felt that difference in his bones before his mind could properly name it. A clock that winds down does so quietly, gradually, like a man falling asleep. But these clocks, and there were dozens of them, covering every shelf, every surface, hanging from hooks along the low timber ceiling, these had been stopped, deliberately, forcefully, as if someone had reached into each one with careful, purposeful fingers and pinched out the life. He counted, later, when he was asked. 43 clocks in total, not one of them showed the same time. Edmund Garrett himself was slumped at his workbench in the center of the room, his chin resting on his chest, in the posture of a man who had simply sat down for a moment's rest and not bothered to wake up again. He was 61 years old, slight of build, with the kind of face that had once been handsome in a quiet, particular way. High cheekbones, a straight nose, silver hair combed back with old-fashioned precision. His hands, resting open on the bench before him, were the hands of a craftsman, fine-fingered, scarred in small ways from small tools, permanently ink-stained at the right thumb. There was a wound at the back of his skull, not large, not theatrical, just a single deliberate blow, delivered with something heavy and smooth, a paperweight, the doctor would later suggest, or the brass head of a clock hammer. Whatever it was, it had not been left behind. Whoever had done this had been careful about that. Careful about a great many things, as it turned out. Constable Higgins stepped back into the lane and blew his whistle with more urgency than he had ever blown it in his 11 years on the force. The morning continued around him with magnificent indifference. A milk cart rattled past. Two women in dark coats exchanged words outside the greengrocer's. A dog investigated something interesting near the far corner and lost interest again. Whitmore Lane was a quiet street in a quiet part of London. The sort of street where nothing happened, where the most dramatic event in recent memory had been old Mrs. Pelham's Persian cat getting lodged behind the drainpipe for 6 hours the previous February. And yet, here it was. Murder. Detective Inspector Farrow arrived within the half hour, red-faced from hurrying and already irritable about it. He was followed by Dr. Pembridge, the divisional surgeon, who carried his bag in one hand and his hat in the other, and managed to look professionally untroubled by the whole affair. 2 constables came after, notebook ready, and trying not to appear as young as they were. Poirot stood in the doorway of the workshop for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "The clocks." "Yes, sir," said Higgins. "They're all stopped." "Yes, sir." "At different times." 43 of them, sir." "I counted." Poirot looked at him. "Why did you count?" Higgins had no satisfactory answer to that. He had simply felt, standing in that room, that counting was the right thing to do, that someone ought to. Dr. Pembridge made his examination with the quiet efficiency of a man who had seen too much to be easily moved. He noted the wound, the position of the body, the temperature of the room against the temperature of the flesh, and arrived at his preliminary conclusion with the careful hedging that years of courtroom experience had taught him was absolutely necessary. "Sometime between 8 o'clock last evening and 2 o'clock this morning," he said, straightening up and pressing his hands against the small of his back. "I'll be more precise once I've done the full examination. Don't hold me to the narrower end of that 6-hour window," Poirot muttered, writing it down. "Wonderful. Murder usually is inconvenient." "Inspector." Poirot ignored this and moved around the room with his hands clasped behind his back, peering at things without touching them. The workshop was orderly in the way that only deeply obsessive men achieve. Every tool in its place, every shelf labeled in small, precise handwriting, every surface clean except for the one at which Garrett sat, which held the dismantled innards of what appeared to be a carriage clock, spread out in careful sequence as if awaiting reassembly. He had been working when it happened then, or at least had appeared to be. On the floor beside the bench, a teacup lay on its side, the contents long dried to a pale brown ring. On the stone floor, the saucer was still on the bench, undisturbed. The cup had fallen or been knocked sideways. There was no other sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no scattered tools, no defensive wounds on the hands, Pembridge confirmed when asked. It had been quick then, and the victim had not seen it coming, or had trusted the person behind him enough not to turn around. It was the clocks that bothered Poirot most. Not in a sentimental way, he was not a sentimental man, but in the practical, procedural way that years of detective work had trained him. Evidence spoke, and these clocks were speaking very loudly about something he could not quite hear yet. He stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, reading the faces. 3:17, 11:42, 7:08, 2:55, 9:31, 6:14. No pattern that he could see. No sequence. They were not stopped in any order that corresponded to the position of the clocks on the shelves. They were not stopped to spell anything. Not that Poirot was the sort to look for that kind of thing, but he looked anyway. They were simply stopped, each at a different, apparently random time. He found himself wondering whether the murderer had done this before or after, whether it had taken long, whether it had been done in haste or with patience, whether it had been done with purpose or out of some strange compulsion that even the killer might not have been able to explain. "Inspector," one of the younger constables appeared at his elbow. "There's a woman outside, says she's the housekeeper. Found the door unlocked this morning when she came to bring his breakfast. Rang for us straight away. Name? Mrs. Doris Croft, sir. She's been with Mr. Garrett for 11 years. Is she composed?" The constable considered this. "She's drinking tea from a flask she brought herself." "Sir, I'd say she's managing." Poirot nodded. "I'll speak with her in a moment." He took one last look around the room. 43 clocks. 43 different times. One dead man who had made it his life's work to understand the precise nature of every moment. He found himself thinking, not for the first time in his career, that he needed help. Specifically, and it cost him something to admit this, even privately, he needed the sort of help that a certain small, fastidious Belgian had been known to provide. On occasions when the Metropolitan Police found itself in possession of a puzzle it could not quite solve on its own, he found the thought irritating. He went to speak to Mrs. Croft anyway, and tried to put it out of his mind. He did not entirely succeed. Poirot arrives, the man with the grey cells. Hercule Poirot was having a difficult morning, even before Inspector Farrow's message arrived. It had begun, as difficult mornings often do, with something small. A crack in his second-best teacup, the one with the pale blue rim that he had owned for 14 years and which had survived 2 house moves, a brief but alarming incident involving a clumsy housemaid and the general hostility of London life. He had noticed the crack while lifting it to his lips, and the discovery had unsettled him in a way he would not have admitted to anyone, except perhaps Captain Hastings, who was unfortunately not present and had not been for some time now. He set the cup down carefully and looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man confronting a small but genuine loss. Then he sighed, a short, precise sigh, the kind that does not invite sympathy, and rang for his valet George to bring him the other set, the good one, which he only used on Sundays and when he had visitors. It was neither Sunday nor did he have visitors, but the crack in the blue-rimmed cup had put him in the sort of mood where small indulgences felt necessary, and Poirot was, above all things, a man who understood the importance of maintaining one's standards, even when, perhaps especially when, the morning had already gone slightly wrong. He was on his second cup and had just settled into his chair by the window with the particular satisfaction of a man who has successfully restored order to a disordered morning, when George appeared with a sealed envelope on a small silver tray. Poirot looked at it without enthusiasm. "It came by hand, monsieur. A constable." He said there was no reply required, but that the matter was urgent. "They always say it is urgent," Poirot said, not moving. "In my experience, Inspector Farrow's definition of urgent and mine have very little in common." He took the envelope. He read it twice, which was his habit, once for content, once for tone. The content was straightforward enough. Edmund Clockmaker, discovered dead at his workshop on Whitmore Lane, wound to the back of the head, no apparent weapon, no apparent motive as yet. Time of death uncertain. And then, in Farrow's particular handwriting, which always pressed slightly too hard on the paper, as if the pen were being held responsible for something, the clocks, all stopped, all different times, can't make head or tail of it, if you're not busy. Poirot lowered the letter and gazed out of the window at the street below, where London was proceeding with its usual grey November indifference. A bus, a woman with a pram, a man in a mackintosh reading a folded newspaper while walking, which Poirot had always considered a small miracle of human coordination. If you're not busy, he was not, strictly speaking, busy. He had correspondence to attend to, and a monograph he had been meaning to read for 3 weeks, and the matter of his afternoon tisane, which he preferred to take at precisely 4 o'clock, and which became less pleasant the more disrupted his day had been. These were not nothing. These were the small architecture of a well-ordered life, and Poirot valued a well-ordered life above almost everything. But 43 clocks, all stopped, all different times. He sat with that for a moment, let the little grey cells, as he was fond of calling them, with a degree of affection that others sometimes found eccentric, let them turn it over quietly, the way one turns a stone to see what lives beneath. Someone had stopped those clocks deliberately. That much was obvious. But why? To confuse the time of death? Possibly. To create some kind of false impression? Perhaps. Or was it something else? Something more personal, more deliberate, more strange? He did not know yet. And not knowing, for Hercule Poirot, was its own particular discomfort. He reached for his hat and coat before he had entirely decided to go. Georges brought the coat with the quiet competence that Poirot had come to depend upon and would never quite bring himself to say so directly. He helped Poirot into it, handed him his cane, and made no comment on the fact that his employer had not finished his tisane. "I may be some time," Poirot said, adjusting his hat in the mirror with the attention it deserved. His moustaches, he was pleased to note, were impeccable. They were always impeccable. This was not vanity. Or not only vanity, but a matter of professional principle. A man whose appearance suggested disorder could not expect to be taken seriously, and Poirot needed very much to be taken seriously, particularly by people who had not yet learned that it was advisable to do so. "Very good, monsieur," said Georges. Poirot paused at the door. Something was nagging at him. Not about the case, not yet, but about the morning, the cup, the crack, the small, irreversible nature of damage. "Georges," he said, without turning around. "Monsieur, the blue-rimmed cup. Do not throw it away." A brief pause. "Of course not, monsieur." He went out into the November morning and pulled his coat a little closer than was strictly necessary. He was not cold, or not very cold. He simply felt, in that particular way that sometimes came upon him without warning, the weight of years. He was not as young as he had been. His knees said so, clearly and without diplomacy, every time he descended stairs too quickly. His eyes, which had once caught details at a glance that other men missed entirely, now sometimes required him to look twice. He did not speak of this to anyone. It was not the sort of thing one spoke of, but it was there, the slight, undeniable friction of time against a man, wearing him down in ways too small to see all at once but too large, in honest moments, to ignore. He hailed a cab and gave the address. Whitmore Lane was the kind of street that looked exactly the same in November as it did in July, because it was the kind of street that discouraged change on principle. The buildings were old, the stones were dark, and the general atmosphere was one of dignified neglect. The kind of neighborhood that had once been respectable and still remembered it, even if the memory had grown a little thin. The workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building wedged between a locksmith and a cobbler, both of which were closed at this hour and would likely remain so, given that a police constable was now standing outside the adjacent door. Expression of a man who has been told to keep people away and intends to do exactly that. Poirot descended from the cab, paid the driver with the precise calculation that had always slightly unnerved cab drivers. Not too little, not too generous, exactly correct, and stood for a moment on the pavement, looking at the building. A hand-painted sign above the door read, E. Garrett, horologist and restorer, by appointment. The paint was old. The sign had not been repainted in some years. Below it, in the window, a display of 4 or 5 clocks had been arranged on a piece of dark velvet, their faces turned outward toward the street like small attentive students. These clocks, Poirot noticed immediately, were still running, still ticking. The murderer had not touched the display window. Interesting. Inspector Farrow appeared in the doorway before Poirot had taken 3 steps toward it. He was a large man in his late 40s, with a broad, capable face that expressed skepticism as its default setting and managed to convey, without ever quite saying so, that he found Poirot's involvement in his cases simultaneously useful and personally galling. "Poirot," he said, not warmly, not unwarmly, simply as a fact. "Inspector." Poirot inclined his head. "You are looking tired. I've been here since 9:30. And it is now." Poirot consulted his watch, a slim gold affair that he kept wound to the second. 11:47. Yes, that would explain it. He stepped past Farrow, into the workshop doorway, and stopped. He stood very still for a moment. The clocks, all those stopped faces looking at him from the walls, the shelves, the ceiling hooks, 43 different times frozen, in 43 different moments, each one sealed like an insect in amber, each one declaring with perfect mechanical certainty something that was almost certainly a lie. Poirot felt, unexpectedly and rather inconveniently, the small hairs rise on the back of his neck. "Mon Dieu," he said softly, not dramatically, simply as a man who has seen many things and is acknowledging, quietly, that this is something new. He stepped into the room and began, with great care, to look. The suspects, faces behind the clock. Poirot did not rush. This was something that had always mildly infuriated Inspector Farrow, who was a man built for action and found stillness professionally uncomfortable. He stood near the doorway with his notebook and watched as the small Belgian moved through the workshop with the patient, unhurried attention of a man reading a very long letter in a language he loves. He crouched, carefully, one hand briefly on the bench for balance, which he would not have needed 5 years ago and did not acknowledge now, to examine the dried ring of tea on the stone floor beside Edmund Garrett's chair. He straightened and studied the spread of dismantled clock parts on the workbench without touching them. He looked at the teacup on its side, the saucer still upright. He looked at the dead man's hands for a long time. Then he turned to the clocks. He went to each one in turn, not all 43, but a careful selection, seemingly random, though with Poirot, nothing was ever truly random. He noted the times. He noted the position of each clock in the room. He noted which ones were wound and which were not, which were dusty and which had been recently handled, which sat naturally in their positions, and which had, perhaps, been moved. Farrow watched all of this and said nothing, because he had learned, over several years and several cases, that interrupting Poirot during this particular phase produced results approximately as useful as interrupting a surgeon mid-operation. Finally, Poirot straightened fully and turned around. "The suspects," he said. "Tell me about the suspects." There were, at that point, 4 people whose connection to Edmund Garrett placed them within what Farrow considered the relevant circle. He laid them out in the manner of a man presenting cards he was not entirely happy with, aware that the hand was incomplete, but having no choice but to play it. The first was Mrs. Doris Croft. She was 63 years old, a widow, built along the lines of a woman who had spent her life doing practical things and had no patience for impractical ones. She had been Edmund Garrett's housekeeper for 11 years, arriving each weekday morning at 8 o'clock to bring his breakfast from the house 3 streets away, where she maintained his domestic arrangements, collecting him at 6 in the evening, if he had not already returned, and generally organizing the non-mechanical aspects of his existence with the same quiet competence that he applied to the mechanical ones. She had found the door to the workshop unlocked that morning. Unusual, she said immediately and firmly, because Mr. Garrett was particular about locking up, always had been, and the door was never left unlocked unless he was inside and had been expecting someone. She had knocked, received no answer, and pushed the door open. She had seen him at his bench, had known immediately that something was wrong. She did not say how she knew, but there was something in the way she said it, Farrow noted, that suggested the knowledge had arrived whole and certain, the way such knowledge sometimes does, and had gone at once for the constable on the corner without touching anything or anyone. Her alibi for the previous evening was, she said, her sister's house in Clapham, where she had taken dinner and stayed until past 10 o'clock. The sister's name was Mrs. Agnes Pryor. Farrow had sent a man to confirm it. Poirot listened to all of this with his hands folded on the head of his cane and his eyes half closed, which meant he was paying very close attention indeed. "She had a key," he said when Farrow finished. It was not a question. "Yes, to the house, not the workshop, and the workshop door was unlocked when she arrived. She says so. You believe her?" Farrow considered. "I believe she found it unlocked. Whether she's the reason it was unlocked." He left it there. Poirot nodded once, slowly, and said nothing further about Mrs. Croft for the moment. The second was Mr. Victor Garrett. He was Edmund's nephew, the only remaining family, as far as anyone had been able to determine in the hours since the discovery. He was 34 years old, worked in an insurance office in the city, and had, by several accounts, a relationship with his uncle that oscillated between cautious affection and outright resentment, depending on which of them you asked and on what occasion. The source of the tension was money. It usually was. Edmund Garrett had, some years ago, possessed a modest but genuine fortune, the accumulated proceeds of a lifetime's skilled work and careful living. He had also some years ago, invested a portion of that fortune in a venture proposed by his nephew, who had at the time been full of enthusiasm and confidence and a business plan that had not survived contact with reality. The venture had failed. The money, approximately £4,000 of it, which was not nothing, had not been recovered. Since then, relations between uncle and nephew had been civil in the way that relations are civil when two people have agreed, without ever discussing it, not to mention the thing that sits between them. Victor Garrett had called at the workshop 2 days ago, on Sunday afternoon. Mrs. Croft confirmed this. She had seen him leaving as she came to drop off a parcel. She could not say what was discussed. She had not heard raised voices, but she had seen Victor Garrett's face as he came out, and the face had not been the face of a man who had just had a pleasant visit. His alibi for the previous evening was that he had been at home alone in his flat in Pimlico, which was to say that he had no alibi at all, which was either honest or convenient, depending on how one looked at it. "He stands to inherit," Farrow said. "We're looking into the will." "And if the will is unfavorable to him?" Poirot asked. "Then motive gets more complicated, or simpler," Poirot said mildly, "depending on what the will says." The third was Miss Rosalind Ayres. She was 27, and she had been Edmund Garrett's apprentice for the past 2 years, a fact that had apparently surprised everyone who knew either of them, since Garrett had not taken an apprentice in over 2 decades and had been known to express, on multiple occasions and with some force, the opinion that the craft of horology was dying because the young had no patience for it. Whatever had changed his mind, Rosalind Ayres had changed it. She was precise, she was quick, and she had, according to Mrs. Croft, who volunteered this information unprompted, a genuine feeling for the work, the kind that could not be taught, only recognized. She came to the workshop 4 days a week. She had her own key to the side door, the only person besides Garrett himself who did. She had also, 6 months ago, submitted a design for a patent, a small but significant improvement to a particular type of clock escapement mechanism. And the question of whose name should appear on the patent had not, as of the previous week, been fully resolved between her and her employer. This last piece of information came not from Mrs. Croft, but from Constable Higgins, who had an aunt who lived 2 streets away and who knew the sort of things that streets know about their inhabitants. Poirot's eyes opened slightly wider when he heard it. "Not much, just enough." "She was here yesterday?" he asked. "Until 4 in the afternoon. She left before him. He was still working when she went. And she is where now?" "At her lodgings in Bermondsey. We've asked her to come in this afternoon." "Good," said Poirot. And then, after a pause, "She had a key to the side door." "Yes, and the side door was locked when we arrived, from the inside." A small silence settled over this fact, and both men regarded it for a moment without speaking. The fourth suspect was, in some ways, the most interesting, and in other ways the most straightforward, though with murder, Poirot had long since learned, straightforward was frequently the most misleading category of all. His name was Mr. Thomas Aldgate. He was 58 years old, heavy-set, with the permanently reddened complexion of a man who had spent too many years in rooms that were either too hot or too cold and had the temperament to match. He was a dealer in antique timepieces, clocks, watches, pocket watches, specialist instruments, and he had been, for the past 18 months, engaged in a legal dispute with Edmund Garrett over the ownership of a particular clock. The clock in question was a bracket clock, early 18th century, English, with an exceptionally fine case, and a movement that Garrett had restored over the course of 8 months, and which he claimed he had agreed to restore, on the understanding that the clock was to be resold and the proceeds split between them. Aldgate claimed no such agreement had existed, and that the clock was entirely his, and Garrett had been paid for his restoration work and was owed nothing further. The matter had gone to a solicitor. The solicitor had found the situation sufficiently ambiguous that it had not yet gone anywhere else, which meant both men had been living with the dispute hanging between them for the better part of a year and a half, growing, as unsettled disputes do, heavier with every month that passed. Aldgate had been seen in Whitmore Lane on Monday evening, yesterday, by the tobacconist across the street, who was a reliable witness in the sense that he had very little to do in the evenings except observe the street from behind his window. He had seen Aldgate standing outside Garrett's workshop at approximately 7:15, looking at the door. He could not say whether Aldgate had knocked. He could not say how long he had stayed. He had looked away at some point, and when he looked back, Aldgate was gone. Aldgate's own account of Monday evening was that he had dined at his club in St. James's until 9 o'clock, verifiable, and had then gone directly home. He acknowledged that he had been in Whitmore Lane earlier in the evening, said he had considered calling on Garrett to attempt one final conversation about the matter, but had thought better of it and left without knocking. A man who admits to being at the scene, Poirot observed. Sometimes the honest thing, Farrow said, and sometimes the strategic thing, Poirot replied pleasantly. When one knows one has been seen. He stood for a long time after Farrow had finished, in the center of the workshop, with the stopped clocks surrounding him on all sides, like an audience waiting for a performance to begin. The afternoon light was thinning. Someone had brought in a lamp. The dead man still sat at his bench, though the doctor's men would take him soon. Poirot looked at him. Edmund Garrett, a man who had spent his life understanding the precise nature of every moment, of every small mechanical heartbeat, of the endlessly patient machinery by which human beings had chosen to measure their existence. Someone had stolen his last moment from him, had taken it quietly and deliberately from behind, and had then done something very strange and very calculated with the time that remained. The grey cells were restless. They were turning things over in the way they did when there was something present that had not yet declared itself. Some fact or detail or inconsistency that sat just beneath the surface of what was visible. Waiting. He was tired. He had not eaten since breakfast. His knees ached from the crouching earlier, and the lamplight was not as good as the morning light had been, and he was aware, in the way one is aware of such things in one's 60s, that the day had taken something from him that would need to be repaid with rest. But the clocks. He looked at them one more time. All those frozen faces, all those stolen moments. Not yet, he told himself. There is something here you have not seen yet. Be patient. He was, above most things, a patient man. He put on his hat, said good evening to Inspector Farrow, and went out into the darkening lane to find a cab. He would sleep on it. Sometimes. Not always. But sometimes. The grey cells did their best work while the rest of him was resting. The investigation deepens. Every clue has a shadow. Poirot slept badly. This was not unusual when a case had settled into him, and this one had settled deeply, the way cold settles into old buildings, finding every gap and crack and making itself at home. He lay in the dark of his bedroom at Whitehaven Mansions and stared at the ceiling with particular wakefulness of a man whose body has agreed to rest, but whose mind has refused the invitation entirely. The clocks kept returning to him, not as a problem to be solved, not yet, but as an image. 43 faces, 43 different moments, each one declared with complete mechanical certainty, each one almost certainly false. Someone had stood in that room and stopped them, one by one, and had chosen different times for each one, and had done so with enough patience and deliberateness that the effect was not random but, what? Overwhelming? Confusing? A kind of visual noise designed to prevent the eye from settling on any one thing, or something else. Something he had not thought of yet. He turned onto his side at 2:30 and told himself firmly to stop thinking about it. He was still thinking about it at 4 o'clock when he finally, grudgingly, fell asleep. He arrived at Inspector Farrow's office at Scotland Yard the following morning at 9 o'clock precisely, which was later than he would have liked and earlier than he felt. and accepted the offer of tea with more gratitude than he would normally have shown in professional company. Poirot had been busy. This, Poirot acknowledged privately, was one of the man's genuine virtues. He was thorough, and he was fast, and when he had the scent of something, he pursued it with the dogged, unimaginative persistence that was, in police work, frequently more valuable than brilliance. The will had been found. Edmund Garrett had made his will 7 years ago with a solicitor in Gray's Inn and had not altered it since. The estate, modest but not negligible, some £2,000 in savings, the contents of the workshop, and a small property in Kent that he had inherited from his own parents and never sold, was divided as follows: £1,000 to Mrs. Doris Croft in recognition of her years of faithful service. The Kent property to be sold proceeds to a horological society of which Garrett had been a long-standing member. The workshop and its contents, the clocks, the tools, the stock, the ongoing restoration commissions, to Miss Rosalind Ayres, on the condition that she continue to operate it as a working workshop for a minimum of 5 years. Victor Garrett, the nephew, received nothing. Not a reduced bequest, not a token amount, nothing, not so much as a mention, except in the negative, a specific clause, added with the particular legal precision that suggests it was not an oversight, but a decision, stating that Edmund Garrett's nephew Victor was excluded from any share of the estate, for reasons the testator did not elaborate upon, but clearly felt required formal acknowledgement. Poirot laid the document on the desk between them, and let Poirot read it in silence. He was cut out entirely, Poirot said, when Poirot looked up. 7 years ago, Poirot said, which means the business with the failed venture. That's when the falling out happened. That's when the will was made. And yet, the nephew continued to visit, once or twice a year, by Mrs. Croft's account. Poirot leaned back in his chair. She thinks he was hoping the old man would change his mind. Soften. You know how it is with family. I know how it is with money, Poirot said, which is frequently indistinguishable from family in these matters. He set the will down carefully and picked up his tea. Victor Garrett visited on Sunday, 2 days before the murder. Mrs. Croft saw his face when he left. It was not the face of a man who had received good news. No, so perhaps he asked. Perhaps he finally asked directly, "Am I in the will, uncle? Am I provided for?" and received his answer. And came back Monday evening. Perhaps. Poirot set down his teacup, or perhaps not. There is still the question of the locked side door. The side door. It had been bothering Poirot too, he admitted. The workshop had 2 entrances. The main door onto Whitmore Lane, which was how clients entered and which had been found unlocked by Mrs. Croft on Tuesday morning, and a side door opening onto a narrow service passage that ran behind the row of buildings. This door had a separate lock, a heavier one, and Rosalind Ayres held the only key besides Garrett's own. When the police had arrived and conducted their initial examination of the premises, the side door had been locked from the inside. The bolt had been thrown, which meant, if the bolt had been thrown after the murder, not before, that whoever had left the workshop after killing Edmund Garrett had left by the main door. But the main door had been found unlocked, which created a sequence. The killer had entered through either door at some point during the evening, had killed Garrett, had gone to the side door and thrown the bolt. Why? And had then left through the main door, which they had either been unable to lock behind them without a key, or had deliberately left unlocked, or had been interrupted before they could secure it. 3 possibilities, Poirot said, counting on his fingers, in the way that suggested he had already been through them several times. 1. The killer had no key to the main door, and therefore could not lock it on leaving. 2. The killer had a key but was too hurried or too disturbed to use it. 3. The killer deliberately left it unlocked. Why would they deliberately leave it unlocked? To ensure discovery, to ensure the body was found before too long. He paused. Or perhaps, and this is a thought I do not yet know what to do with, to direct our attention towards someone who does have a key. Farrow looked at him. Mrs. Croft, she has a key to the house, not the workshop. Rosalind Ayres, she has a key to the side door, which was bolted from the inside. Poirot spread his hands. You see the difficulty. Every door leads to a wall.
For the moment, Poirot agreed. For the moment. Rosalind Ayres arrived at Scotland Yard at 11 o'clock. She was not what Poirot had expected, though he would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what he had expected. She was slight, dark-haired, with the kind of face that looked younger than it was until you noticed the eyes, which were watchful and precise and missed very little. She wore a plain dark coat and no jewelry except a small watch on her left wrist. A good one, Poirot noted automatically. Not expensive, but good. Accurate. She sat across the table from Poirot and Farrow and folded her hands in her lap and waited, which was itself interesting. Most people in that room, in that situation, felt compelled to fill the silence. She did not. Miss Ayres, Poirot began, you have our condolences. Mr. Garrett was, by all accounts, a man of considerable skill. He was, she said, simply, without elaboration. You were his apprentice for 2 years. Yes, and you were here yesterday, Monday, until 4 in the afternoon, until 4:10. I remember, because I checked the time before I left. One of the restoration pieces was due on Wednesday, and I was behind where I wanted to be. Garrett was still here when you left. Yes, he was at his bench, the same bench. A brief pause. He said good night. I said I would be in early Wednesday to finish the Beaumont commission. He seemed normal, in good spirits. She considered this with the care of someone who does not like imprecision. He seemed tired. He'd been tired all week, but not upset, not frightened, not distracted in any unusual way. Did he mention expecting a visitor that evening? No. Did he mention Thomas Aldgate? Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not guilt, not fear. Something more like the controlled reaction of a person who has been expecting a particular name and is managing their response to hearing it. Not Monday, no. But he had mentioned him. Aldgate had been in contact the previous week. He wanted to come to an agreement about the bracket clock before the matter went to court. Mr. Garrett told me he had no intention of settling on Aldgate's terms. He said that directly. He said, she paused, choosing words carefully. He said that Aldgate had been taking advantage of craftsmen for 30 years, and he was not going to be the one who let him do it without consequence. Poirot nodded slowly.
And the patent matter, Miss Ayres, the escapement design, a silence, slightly longer than the others. That was a private matter between myself and Mr. Garrett. I understand. Nevertheless, she looked at him steadily. We had a disagreement about it. Yes, I felt the design was mine. I had developed it outside of working hours, using my own materials, working from my own thinking. Mr. Garrett felt that as my employer, and as the person whose workshop had provided the context and foundation for my work, he had a legitimate claim to co-authorship. That must have been frustrating. It was. It is, she corrected herself quietly. It was. And yet, you continued to work with him. Yes. Why? For the first time, something in her composure softened slightly. Not dramatically, not sentimentally, but in the way that genuine feeling sometimes surfaces in people who have learned to keep it mostly submerged. Because he was the best I had ever seen, she said, and because what I could learn from him was worth more than the argument. I had decided to pursue the patent separately, through my own solicitor. It did not need to end the arrangement between us. Poirot looked at her for a long moment. Your key to the side door, he said. May I see it? She reached into her coat pocket without hesitation and placed it on the table between them. Poirot picked it up, turned it over once. Set it down again. Thank you. he said. "That is all for the moment, Miss Ayres." Victor Garrett came in at 2 o'clock and managed, in the space of 20 minutes, to be simultaneously defensive and aggrieved and carefully composed in a way that suggested he had spent the morning deciding how to be all three at once. He confirmed the Sunday visit. Yes, he had called on his uncle. No, it had not been a comfortable conversation. He had asked, he admitted after a pause that lasted slightly too long, whether his uncle had any intention of revising the arrangements he had made some years ago. His uncle had said, with the particular quietness that Edmund Garrett apparently employed when he wanted to be absolutely clear, that he had given the matter every consideration it deserved, and his position had not changed, and he did not expect it to. Victor had left. He had not, he said, gone back Monday evening. He had no idea what he had been doing at 7:15. He had been at home. Alone, Farrow said. Alone, Victor confirmed, with the defensive straightness of a man who knows how this sounds and resents that it sounds that way. After he had gone, Poirot sat for a while in the chair by Farrow's window and looked out at the street below and thought about the will, about the fact that Rosalind Ayres inherited the workshop, about the fact that Victor Garrett inherited nothing, about Mrs. Croft's £1,000, about Thomas Aldgate and a bracket clock and 30 years of taking advantage of craftsmen, about 43 stopped clocks, about a side door bolted from the inside, about a teacup fallen on its side while its saucer remained perfectly upright on the bench. This last detail had been sitting at the back of his mind since the previous morning, quiet and patient, waiting to be properly considered. He considered it now. If a man is struck from behind with enough force to kill him, his body goes forward, his head goes down, his hands, resting on a bench, may slide forward, may fall. But a cup held loosely, or perhaps not held at all, perhaps already set down, might roll, might fall from the bench, might land on its side. But the saucer remained upright, which meant the cup and saucer had been separated before the blow. The cup had been in his hand, or close to it. Perhaps he had just set it down beside the saucer, or perhaps someone had moved the saucer, or perhaps he stopped himself. This was the danger of the grey cells when they were tired. They moved too fast, made connections before they were ready to be made. He needed more information before he allowed himself to theorize too freely. He needed, he decided, to go back to the workshop. There was something there he had not yet properly seen. He was certain of it. He was fairly certain of it. He put on his hat and went. The twist. When time becomes a lie. The workshop was quieter now. The body had been removed, the doctor's men having come and gone with the careful, practiced efficiency of people who do difficult work and have learned not to think too hard about it. A constable remained at the door, a different one from the previous day, younger, with the particular alertness of someone who has been told this posting is important and is taking the instructions seriously. Poirot showed his credentials and was admitted without difficulty. He stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, which was his habit in rooms he had already visited, to see whether the room looked different from the threshold than it had the day before. Now that he knew more about it, sometimes it did. Sometimes a room, once you understood something of what had happened inside it, rearranged itself slightly in the eye, showed you things it had been withholding. The workshop looked, if anything, more itself, without the presence of the police and the doctor and Farrow's large, useful, slightly oppressive energy. A craftsman's room, ordered and purposeful, and very still. The clocks were still stopped. Farrow had wanted to have them collected as evidence, but Poirot had asked him, politely and with the particular firmness that his politeness sometimes contained, to leave them in place for another day. Farrow had agreed with the expression of a man who is agreeing because he has learned to and not because he wants to. Poirot was glad of it. He went to the nearest clock first, a small bracket clock on the shelf to the left of the main door. Its hands stopped at 3:17. and looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he did touch it. Carefully, he lifted it from the shelf, turned it over, examined the back, wound it slightly to test the mechanism, and set it down. He moved to the next, and the next. He was not, at this stage, entirely sure what he was looking for. This was unusual for him, and faintly uncomfortable. He preferred to know precisely what question he was trying to answer before he went about answering it. But sometimes, with a case that had this quality of deliberate obscurity, this sense of something having been constructed rather than merely committed, you had to allow yourself to look without purpose for a while, and trust that the purpose would declare itself. He had reached the 7th clock, a long case regulator, tall and narrow, its pendulum hanging motionless. When something declared itself, he stood very still. Then he went back to the first clock, the bracket clock, 3:17. He looked at it again, not at the hands, at the clock itself, the case, the position on the shelf, the faint disturbance in the dust around its base. He went to the second clock, 11:42, a carriage clock on the workbench, to the right of the dead man's chair. He looked at the dust around its base. He went to the third, the fourth, the fifth, 6th, 7th. By the time he had examined 12 clocks, he was quite sure. By the time he had examined 20, he was completely certain. He straightened up slowly. His back was reminding him, not subtly, that he had been crouching and bending for the better part of 40 minutes, and stood in the center of the room and allowed the thing he had found to settle properly into place before he looked at it directly. Not all 43 clocks had been moved. Most of them had. The majority, perhaps 35 or 36 of them, had been taken from their usual positions, or at least handled. The dust around their bases disturbed in the way that only happens when something is lifted and replaced, even carefully. But a handful, 7, by his count, showed no such disturbance. Their bases sat in undisturbed rings of fine workshop dust, the kind that accumulates over weeks and months in the crevices of a craftsman's room and is not moved by anything short of direct physical contact. These 7 clocks had not been touched, and they were all stopped. Poirot looked at his list. He had been making notes in his small leather notebook and considered the times shown by the untouched clocks: 7:08, 6:52, 7:14, 7:03, 6:58, 7:11, 7:06. He read them twice, then he sat down, quite heavily. In the chair, nearest to hand, Edmund Garrett's own chair, at the workbench, which he would not normally have done. But his knees had decided the matter before his manners could intervene, and stared at the numbers in his notebook: 6:52, 6:58, 7:03, 7:06, 7:08, 7:11, 7:14, 7 clocks, all stopped within a 22-minute window, all between 5 minutes to 7 and 1/4 past. These were the clocks that had not been moved. These were the clocks that had been stopped where they stood, in their natural positions, without being lifted or repositioned. These were, in all probability, the clocks that had been stopped first, stopped at the actual time they showed, because at that moment they were simply being stopped, not being set to a false time. The killer had begun stopping clocks at approximately 5 minutes to 7 in the evening, and had then, having realized that a room full of clocks, all stopped at the same time, was too obvious, too clean, too clearly pointing to a single moment, had then begun the slower, more careful work, had taken the remaining clocks from their shelves, one by one, and wound them back or forward to different times, and replaced them, creating the impression of chaos, of meaninglessness, of 43 different moments that told no coherent story. It had been clever. It had been very nearly clever enough. Poirot sat in Edmund Garrett's chair and thought about what this meant. The murder had occurred at or shortly before 5 minutes to 7. The killer had then spent how long? He thought about the number of clocks. 36 to be repositioned, wound to false times, carefully replaced, even working quickly. That was not a short task. 15 minutes at minimum, perhaps 20, perhaps more, which placed the killer in the workshop until at least 7:15, possibly later. The tobacconist across the street had seen Thomas Aldgate outside at 7:15, but Aldgate had said he had only stood outside, had not knocked, had gone away. Poirot considered this. If Aldgate was telling the truth, then whoever was inside the workshop at 7:15, still working, still adjusting clocks, had not been Aldgate. Aldgate had been outside, looking at the door, and had seen, what? A light inside. Had he known someone was in there? Had he knocked after all, and received no answer, because the person inside was crouching behind a workbench with their hands around a clock they were in the process of setting to a false time? Or had Aldgate been inside earlier, before 7, and left before the clock stopping began, and had then returned at 7:15 for reasons of his own? Or had Aldgate been inside when the murder happened, seen or heard something, and was now constructing a story that placed him outside and uninvolved? Too many possibilities. He needed to eliminate some of them before he could see clearly. He made a note. Aldgate, what did he see from outside? Was there a light? Was the door open or closed? Did he hear anything? Then he made another note, below it, which he underlined once. Why bolt the side door from the inside? This was the detail that had been nagging at him since the previous day, and now, with the clock discovery sitting in his mind alongside it, it nagged harder. The side door had been bolted from the inside. This meant one of three things. Either Rosalind Ayres, the only other person with a key to that door, had used her key to enter that way and bolted the door behind her for some reason, or someone had bolted the door from inside at some earlier point, perhaps Garrett himself, before the killer arrived, and the killer had therefore not needed to worry about that entrance at all. Or the killer had bolted the side door deliberately after the murder to prevent access from that direction, and had then left by the main door. But why would the killer want to prevent access from the side door specifically, unless the killer knew or feared that someone might arrive via that door, someone with a key to that door, someone like Rosalind Ayres? He found her that afternoon, not at her lodgings in Bermondsey. She was not there, not at the workshop. He found her, after an hour of increasingly irritated searching, that he would not have called irritated to anyone's face, but which was nevertheless beginning to affect his composure, at the Horological Society of which Edmund Garrett had been a member, where she had gone, she explained with the straightforward calm that was apparently her natural register, to inform them of his death before they read it in the papers. She was sitting in a small anteroom with a cup of tea she had not touched, and she looked up when Poirot entered without visible surprise, which itself told him something. "You knew I would come," he said. "I thought you might," she said. "You are more thorough than the inspector." He sat down across from her. "Miss Ayres, I wish to ask you something directly, and I would like you to consider your answer carefully before giving it. Not because I think you will lie. I do not think you are in the habit of lying, but because I think there is something you know that you have not yet decided whether to tell." She looked at him steadily, said nothing. "The side door," Poirot said. "The bolt. You bolted it yourself, did you not? Before you left on Monday." A long silence. "Yes," she said at last. "Why?" She set down the untouched teacup with precision. "Because when I left at 4:10, there was someone in the lane outside, near the side entrance. I didn't see them clearly. It was already getting dark, but I had the impression of someone watching the door, waiting. And you bolted it to prevent them from entering that way." "I bolted it because Mr. Garrett had his back to the side door when he worked. He couldn't see it from his bench. And I—" She stopped, started again. "I had an uneasy feeling. I can't account for it more precisely than that. I bolted the door, and I told myself I was being foolish, and I went home." "Did you tell Mr. Garrett you had bolted it?" "No, he would have asked why, and I had no good reason, only a feeling." "Did you see who was outside? Any detail at all?" She hesitated. This hesitation was different from the others, less composed, more reluctant. "A coat," she said finally. "Dark. And the person was larger. Heavier. Not tall, but broad." Poirot was quiet for a moment. Thomas Aldgate was heavy-set. Not tall, but broad. "Miss Ayres," he said carefully, "if you had bolted the side door from inside, and the killer arrived and found it bolted, they would have needed to enter another way." "The main door," she said. "Yes, I thought of that. And if they entered by the main door, they could not lock it from the outside when they left, because they had no key to that door." She looked at him. Something in her expression, not quite fear, but a close cousin of it, shifted. "Then it wasn't one of us," she said quietly. "Not me, not Mrs. Croft. We both have keys. We could both have locked it." "So it would appear," Poirot said, though he did not say, not yet, not until he was certain, that having a key and choosing not to use it were two entirely different things, and that the most elegant alibi was sometimes not the one that proved you were elsewhere. It was the one that made someone else's presence necessary. He thanked her, stood, and walked out into the grey afternoon. His mind was moving quickly now. The little grey cells, which had been restless and unsatisfied since Monday evening, had found something to hold on to, and were holding on with both hands. He was not ready to name it yet, but he was getting close. The unraveling, the grey cells speak. Poirot did not go home immediately. He walked instead, which was not his usual preference. He was not, by nature or by inclination, a man who walked for the sake of walking, and London in November offered very little inducement to reconsider this position. The pavements were damp. The air had the particular grey quality of a city that has forgotten what sunlight looks like and is not especially troubled by the omission. His coat was adequate but not generous, and his shoes, which were excellent shoes, were nevertheless shoes designed for the interiors of cabs and offices and well-heated drawing rooms, rather than the wet stones of a London afternoon. And yet he walked, because sometimes, not always, but sometimes, and more frequently than he would once have admitted, the thing the grey cell needed was not silence or stillness, but motion, the rhythm of feet on pavement, the small, continuous adjustments of navigation, stepping around a puddle, yielding to an oncoming pedestrian, pausing at a crossing. These small physical demands, paradoxically, freed the larger mental ones, gave the mind enough to do with one hand, so that the other could work undisturbed. He walked for 40 minutes. By the time he turned back toward Whitehaven Mansions, he had it. Not all of it, not every detail, not every confirmation, but the shape of it, the essential architecture. Who and why and how the clocks fit into it. He stopped on the pavement outside a tobacconist's, not the one from Whitmore Lane, a different one entirely, and stood there for a moment in the thin drizzle with his hat growing damp and his shoes registering their objections, and allowed himself the small, private satisfaction of a man who has found what he was looking for. Then he went home, changed his shoes, drank his tisane, and wrote 4 letters. The letters went out that evening by hand, Georges dispatching them with his usual quiet efficiency, and returning with the confirmations Poirot needed. Each letter requested the recipient's presence the following morning at 11 o'clock at workshop on Whitmore Lane, Mrs. Doris Croft, Miss Rosalind Ayres, Mr. Victor Garrett, Mr. Thomas Aldgate. A 5th letter went to Inspector Farrow, requesting the same, and containing additionally a list of 3 specific things Poirot needed confirmed before morning. The precise time that Thomas Aldgate's club recorded him leaving on Monday evening, the full record of any correspondence between Edmund Garrett and his solicitor regarding the will in the past 12 months, and the name of the Patent Office clerk who had handled Rosalind Ayres's escapement design submission. Farrow's written reply arrived at 9:30 that evening, which was fast even by his standards, and suggested he had put men onto it immediately, which meant his own curiosity had overcome his professional reluctance to appear too eager. Aldgate's club had him departing at 8:47, not 9 o'clock, as Aldgate had stated. 8:47. A 13-minute discrepancy that Aldgate had presumably judged small enough not to matter, or had simply misremembered, or had chosen to round in a direction that suited him. 13 minutes. In a case built around the manipulation of time, 13 minutes was not nothing. Garrett's solicitor had received a letter from his client 6 weeks ago, requesting information about the process by which a will might be amended. The solicitor had replied with the relevant details. No amendment had subsequently been made. The will on record remained the one written 7 years ago. 6 weeks ago, Edmund Garrett had been thinking about changing his will, and had not done so. The patent clerk's name was Mr. Frederick Hoyle. He had processed Miss Ayres's application 3 months ago and could confirm Farrow had apparently telephoned him at home, which the man had not been delighted about, that the application had been submitted in Rosalind Ayres' name alone, and that a letter of objection had subsequently been filed by a Mr. E. Garrett of Whitmore Lane, citing co-authorship, and that the matter was currently suspended pending resolution of the dispute. Poirot read all of this twice, made several careful notes, and went to bed at 11 o'clock. He slept well, deeply and well, for the first time since Monday. The grey cells, having done their work, had finally consented to rest. He arrived at Whitmore Lane at 10:30 the following morning, half an hour before the others were due, and spent the time in the workshop alone. He walked the room once more, slowly, with the settled attention of a man who is no longer looking for something because he has already found it and is now simply confirming its dimensions. He looked at the clocks, all still stopped, all still showing their false times, except the 7 that showed their true ones. He looked at the workbench, the saucer, the spread of clock parts awaiting an assembly that would now never come. He looked at the chair in which Edmund Garrett had died. He thought about the man. Not the victim, the man. 61 years old, precise, private, skilled beyond what most people would ever appreciate or recognize. A man who had spent his life understanding time and had been robbed of his own with a single blow from behind. There was something particularly cruel about that. Poirot felt it without sentimentality. He had learned long ago that sentiment, in these rooms, clouded rather than clarified, but he felt it nonetheless. A quiet anger, the kind that does not shout, the kind that sits in the chest like a cold weight and gives you reasons to be thorough. He heard footsteps in the lane outside and straightened. Bon, he thought, let us begin. They came in, one by one, with the uncertain wariness of people who have been summoned to a place they would rather not be and are not entirely sure what is expected of them. Mrs. Croft arrived first. As Poirot had expected, she was the kind of woman who arrived first to things as a matter of principle. She wore her dark coat and carried her flask of tea and positioned herself near the window with the composure of someone who has decided to be unfrightened and is making a decent job of it. Rosalind Ayres came next, precise and punctual to the minute, and took a position near the workbench. Near, Poirot noted, but not at it. Close enough to see it, far enough to maintain distance. Victor Garrett arrived 3 minutes late and managed to communicate, without saying anything, that he resented the summons and found the location distasteful, and was only here because not being here would have looked worse than being here. He stood near the door with his hands in his coat pockets, and his jaw set in a way that suggested he was prepared for an unpleasant experience, was managing it through the simple mechanism of existing in a state of preemptive indignation. Thomas Aldgate came last, at 4 minutes past 11, with the air of a man who is slightly too large for the room and knows it and has decided this is the room's fault. He looked around at the stopped clocks with the professional assessment of someone in the trade and revealed nothing of what he thought about them. Inspector Farrow stood by the door, notebook ready, expression neutral in the way that suggested he was working quite hard to keep it that way. Poirot looked at them all, took a moment, let the silence settle. Then he began. "I thank you all for coming," he said, in the mild, conversational tone that people who did not know him sometimes mistook for the preamble to something unremarkable. "I will not keep you longer than is necessary. What I have to say is not complicated. The truth, in my experience, rarely is. It is only the construction placed around it that creates the appearance of complexity." He moved to the center of the room and turned slowly, as if consulting the clocks. "When I first entered this room," he said, "I was struck, as everyone was struck, by the clocks. 43 of them, all stopped, all at different times. The immediate impression, and it was an impression very carefully designed to be immediate, was of chaos, of meaninglessness, of a room in which time had simply shattered." He paused. "But time does not shatter. That is the one thing time does not do. It proceeds, always forward, always at the same rate. It cannot be scattered or confused or rearranged. It can only be misrepresented." He looked at them steadily, and that is what someone in this room did. They misrepresented time. They took 36 clocks from their positions, wound them to false times, and replaced them with the intention of making it impossible to determine when Edmund Garrett died. "And did it work?" Victor Garrett asked. His tone was somewhere between sarcasm and genuine inquiry. "Very nearly," Poirot said pleasantly. "Very nearly indeed. If the killer had been a little more patient or a little less hurried, it might have worked entirely. But 7 clocks were missed." A silence. "Missed?" Mrs. Croft said. 7 clocks in this room were stopped at their true time and not subsequently altered. Not because the killer forgot them. I do not think this was a person who forgot things easily, but because they ran out of time, became hurried. Something interrupted the work, or the work took longer than anticipated, and 7 clocks were left untouched. He gestured toward the shelf nearest the side door. These 7 clocks all stopped within a window of 22 minutes, between 6:52 and 7:14 in the evening. That is when Edmund Garrett was killed. That is the true time. Another silence, different in quality from the first, denser, more careful. Aldgate shifted his weight. "How do you know those 7 weren't also set to false times?" "Because of the dust," Poirot said. "Each clock that was moved left a disturbance in the dust beneath it. These 7 did not. They were not moved. They were stopped where they stood, at the time they showed, by someone moving through this room in increasing haste as the evening wore on, and the work was not yet complete." He paused, "And by 7:15, as we know, there was someone standing outside this workshop, on the pavement, looking at the door." He looked at Thomas Aldgate. Aldgate met his gaze, did not look away, which told Poirot something. An innocent man might look away from an accusatory gaze out of social discomfort. A guilty man might look away out of guilt. A man who had something specific to hide, but not the murder, held your gaze because he had already decided exactly how much he was going to admit to and was holding the line. "You were here earlier," Poirot said. "Not at 7:15. You returned at 7:15. But you were here before 6:52. I told the police. You told the police you had considered calling on Mr. Garrett and had decided against it. This is not entirely false. You came. You knocked. He admitted you. You had a conversation about the bracket clock, a final attempt to reach agreement, as Miss Ayres has told us you intended. The conversation did not go well. You left." Poirot's voice remained conversational. "At what time did you leave, Mr. Aldgate?" A long pause. Farrow's pencil was motionless above his notebook. 6:30, Aldgate said finally. "Approximately. And Garrett was alive when you left." "Of course he was." Something flashed in the heavy face. Genuine indignation, Poirot judged. And genuine was interesting. "I argued with the man. I did not kill him." "No," Poirot said quietly. "No, I do not think you did." He turned away from Aldgate and let the room breathe for a moment. After Aldgate left at approximately 6:30, Poirot continued, "Edmund Garrett continued working. The clocks begin stopping at 6:52, which means someone else arrived, or revealed themselves, between 6:30 and 6:52. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew his notebook.
Opened it to a page he had marked. 6 weeks ago, Mr. Garrett wrote to his solicitor inquiring about the process of amending a will. He did not, in the end, make any amendment.
The will on record remains as it was written 7 years ago. He looked up, but the fact that he inquired suggests he was considering it. Considering changing something. He paused. The question is, what was he considering changing? And who knew he was considering it? He looked at Rosalind Ayres. She was very still. The stillness of a person who knows what is coming and has decided the only dignified response is to receive it without flinching. You knew, Poirot said, not unkindly. He told me, she said, 3 weeks ago. He said he had been thinking about the patent dispute, that he had perhaps been unreasonable, that he wanted to make it right. Her voice was steady, controlled. He said he was considering removing the objection to my patent application, and a pause, and revising certain provisions of the will. Yes, Victor Garrett made a sound. Not quite a word, something that wanted to be one. He was going to change it, Poirot said, to include you more generously. He implied as much. He didn't state it directly, but you understood. I understood, and 3 weeks later, he was dead. Poirot said it without inflection, simply as a sequence. The room was completely silent now. Rosalind Ayres looked at him with those watchful, precise eyes. If you are suggesting that I killed him to prevent him changing the will, she said carefully, you have the logic precisely backwards. He was going to change it in my favor. I had no reason to want him dead. No, Poirot said. You did not. And he turned, finally, to the person he had been moving toward since he began. The reveal. Who stole the final moment? The room had the quality of a held breath. Poirot had experienced this moment many times over the course of his career. This particular stillness that descended on a gathering of people when they understood, collectively and without anyone having said so directly, that the thing they had all been waiting for was now imminent. It was not a comfortable stillness. It was the stillness of people who are afraid of what the next 30 seconds will contain and cannot prevent themselves from wanting them to arrive anyway. He stood in the center of the workshop, surrounded by his 43 stopped clocks, and he looked at Mrs. Doris Croft. She looked back at him with the steady, undemonstrative composure of a woman who had been managing difficult situations for 63 years and had not yet encountered one she could not face. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her flask of tea was in her coat pocket. Her expression was the expression of a person who has already decided something and is waiting, with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting, for the rest of the world to catch up. Mrs. Croft, Poirot said. Mr. Poirot, she said. Her voice was entirely level. You have been Mr. Garrett's housekeeper for 11 years. I have. You knew his habits, his routines, when he worked late, when he did not, who visited him and when, what he worried about, what he valued. He paused. You knew about the will. I knew I was in it. He told me that years ago. It was kind of him. £1,000. Yes. A significant sum. For someone in my position, yes. She said it without resentment and without embarrassment. Simply as a fact. But not, Poirot said carefully, if the will were to be changed. Something shifted, barely perceptibly, the way light shifts in a room when a cloud passes over the sun outside. A change so slight you might persuade yourself you had not seen it. But Poirot saw it. I don't know what you mean, she said. I think you do, Poirot said gently. Mr. Garrett told Miss Ayres he was considering revising certain provisions. He was a precise man, precise in his language as in everything else. Revising provisions, to a man like Edmund Garrett, would have meant a specific and deliberate reallocation. Money that was currently allocated one way to be allocated another. He paused. He was considering a more generous provision for Miss Ayres, whose talent he had come to recognize as extraordinary and whose patent dispute he had come to feel guilty about. A more generous provision for her would have meant a less generous provision for someone else. The estate was not large enough to increase one bequest without reducing another. Mrs. Croft said nothing. "He told you," Poirot said. It was not a question. A long silence. Outside, a cart passed in the lane.
The sound came through the walls, muffled and distant, from another world entirely. "He mentioned it," she said at last. The words came out carefully, one at a time, like a person crossing ice
and testing each step. Last week, he said he had been giving thought to making sure Rosalind was properly provided, that she had done more for him than he had perhaps acknowledged. And he said this to you directly. He said it while I was setting his breakfast. He wasn't making an announcement. He was thinking aloud. He did that sometimes. Forgot I was there. A slight pause. Or didn't mind that I was. But you minded. She was quiet. Mrs. Croft. Poirot's voice was still gentle, but there was something beneath the gentleness now. Something that did not yield. You have been with this man for 11 years. You have brought his breakfast every morning and collected him every evening and managed the domestic arrangements of his life with complete competence and complete loyalty. You knew what you were owed, and you knew when he stood in his kitchen on an ordinary morning and thought aloud about revising his provisions, that what he was casually reconsidering was the security that you had spent 11 years earning. Mrs. Croft's hands, folded in front of her, tightened slightly. The knuckles showed white. £1,000, Poirot said quietly. To you, it was not a number. It was the difference between a comfortable old age and an uncomfortable one, between independence and dependence, between dignity and something less than dignity. You make it sound very simple, she said. Her voice had changed. Not broken. She was not a woman who broke easily, but changed. Something beneath the composure had shifted, like furniture moved in a darkened room. Human nature is often simple, Poirot said. That is not a criticism. It is merely an observation. He looked at her steadily. You went to the workshop on Monday evening. A pause. I had forgotten his supper, she said. The words came out flat, rehearsed, and they both knew it. I remembered after I got home. I went back. At what time? Shortly before 7. And Aldgate had already left. I don't know anything about Aldgate. The main door was unlocked. I knocked and went in. She stopped. And? Poirot said, very quietly. He was at his bench, working. Her voice had dropped to something barely above conversational. I told him I had brought his supper. He thanked me. And then she stopped again. He told you, Poirot said, more directly this time. He had been to the solicitor that day, or had written to confirm his intentions. And he told you what he intended to do. A very long silence. He was kind about it, she said finally. And something in the way she said it, not bitter, not resentful, but something far more complicated than either, made the room feel very quiet indeed. He said I had been invaluable. He said £1,000 had seemed generous when he wrote the will. But that was 7 years ago, and things had changed, and he wanted to be fair to everyone. He said he hoped I would understand. And did you? I understood that 11 years of my life was worth less to him than a 2-year disagreement about a patent. Her voice was controlled. Completely, effortfully controlled. I understood that. The clock hammer, Poirot said. A silence. It was on the bench beside him, she said. He used it to demonstrate something. The mechanism he was working on. He put it down. He turned back to his work. And she stopped. Drew a breath. I didn't plan it. I want you to know that. Whatever else you think of me, I want you to know it was not planned. I know, Poirot said. And he did know. He had known since the teacup. The cup that had fallen from the bench onto the floor while the saucer remained upright. A man who is struck from behind while working does not have time to set down what he is holding. The cup would have still been in his hand, or very nearly. But Edmund Garrett had set his cup down, had turned to speak to someone he trusted, someone who stood behind him without alarm, and had set his cup down on the bench beside the saucer, in the absent, automatic way of a man who intends to pick it up again in a moment. He had been speaking to Mrs. Croft, and she had been standing behind him, and the cup had fallen, not from his hand, but from the bench, jarred by the force of his body going forward. The saucer had not fallen because it was farther from the edge. A small detail, the kind of detail that only means something when you already know the shape of the whole. "The clocks," Poirot said. "After, I didn't know what to do." Her voice was quieter now. The composure was still there, but it had become something different, thinner, the way ice becomes when the temperature begins to rise, still holding but only just. I stood there for I don't know how long, and then I thought, if they can't tell when it happened, they can't know who was here. So I started. She paused. There were so many of them. I didn't realize how many there were until I started. I tried to do them all, but She looked at her hands. My hands were shaking. The 7 clocks, the ones she had not reached, the ones she had left, stopped at their true times because her hands were shaking, and her nerve was going, and the weight of what she had done was pressing down on her with the full and irresistible gravity of reality. "You bolted the side door," Poirot said. "I didn't want anyone coming in while I was—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. "And when you left, you could not lock the main door. You had a key to the house, not the workshop." "No." A pause. I thought perhaps people would think someone had broken in. A stranger. Someone who had no key. And instead, it pointed to someone who had no key. Poirot said quietly, "Yes, I see the logic. It was not unreasonable logic. Under the circumstances." He said it without cruelty, without satisfaction. Murder, in his experience, was almost never the act of a simply wicked person. It was almost always the act of an ordinary person in an extraordinary moment. A moment where the accumulated weight of something had finally exceeded what a human being could carry, and the structure had given way. This did not excuse it. Nothing excused it. But it explained it. And explanation, for Poirot, was always more important than condemnation. Edmund Garrett had not been a cruel man. He had been a precise, somewhat self-contained man, who had made his decisions according to his own careful reckoning, and had perhaps not fully understood the weight those decisions carried for others. He had told his housekeeper, kindly and reasonably, and without any conception of what he was doing, that 11 years of her life were being quietly redistributed, and he had then turned back to his work. And Doris Croft had looked at the clock hammer on the bench beside his hand. And the little grey cells, for all their remarkable qualities, could not have prevented what happened next. No one could have. Pharaoh had been very still throughout all of this. Now he moved, stepped forward, closed his notebook, exchanged a glance with Poirot that contained a great deal and expressed very little. "Mrs. Croft," he said. His voice was not unkind. "I'll need you to come with me." She nodded. She had, Poirot thought, been expecting this since she walked through the door. Possibly since Tuesday morning, when she had knocked on the unlocked workshop door and found Edmund Garrett at his bench and had stood there for a moment. He was certain of this, though he could not prove it, not because she did not know something was wrong, but because she did know and was taking a last moment before the world changed irrevocably. She picked up her flask from the workbench beside her, held it for a moment. "Set it back down. Will someone," she said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "see to the house? He has plants on the kitchen windowsill. They'll need watering." Nobody answered immediately. "I will see to it," Rosalind Ayres said. Her voice was careful, controlled. Whatever she was feeling, she was managing it with the same precision she brought to everything. Mrs. Croft nodded once. Then she walked to the door with Farrow beside her and did not look back. The room was very quiet after they left. Victor Garrett released a breath he appeared to have been holding for the past 20 minutes and looked at the floor and said nothing. Thomas Aldgate looked at his hands and appeared to be conducting some private internal reckoning. Rosalind Ayres stood by the workbench with her arms folded and her eyes on the middle distance, seeing something that was not in the room. Poirot stood among the stopped clocks and felt, as he always felt in these moments, the particular exhaustion that was not quite physical and not quite emotional, but something that lived in the space between the two. The weariness of having been right, of having followed the thread all the way to the end and found, as the thread always led, to a human being. He picked up his hat from the stool where he had set it at the beginning and turned it in his hands for a moment. "Monsieur Poirot," Rosalind Ayres said. Her voice was quiet. "The will, if it was not changed." "It was not changed," Poirot confirmed. "The will on record remains as written 7 years ago. £1,000 to Mrs. Croft. The workshop and contents to you. The Kent property to the Horological Society." She absorbed this. Then she did it for nothing. Poirot looked at her steadily. She did not know it was for nothing. She believed, when she came here Monday evening, that she was about to lose what she had spent 11 years working toward. Whether that belief would have proved correct. He paused. "We cannot know. Mr. Garrett was a precise man, but he was also, I think, a man who found decisive action difficult. He had been considering changes for 6 weeks and had not yet made them. He may never have made them." A pause. "Or he may have." The point is that she believed he would, and that belief was enough. Rosalind Ayres nodded slowly. "He was going to withdraw the patent objection," she said. "He told me that clearly. Whatever else he intended or didn't intend, he told me that clearly." "Yes," Poirot said. "I believe he was. I believe he was, in his careful and somewhat late way, trying to put things right." He put on his hat. "I am sorry," he said, to the room in general, and to her in particular, that he did not have more time to do so. He walked to the door, stopped, turned back once, not from sentiment, he told himself, simply from habit, the old professional instinct to take one last look. The workshop, the bench, the tools laid out in their careful order, the clock parts awaiting an assembly that would not now be completed by the hands they had been waiting for, and the clocks, all those stopped faces, all those stolen moments, frozen at false times, all except 7, which had told the truth all along, quietly and without drama, in the way that truth usually does. He had a sudden irrational impulse to wind them, to set them going again, to fill the room with the sound of 43 mechanisms ticking back into motion, restoring to this quiet space some sense of time moving forward as it always does, as it insists on doing, regardless of what human beings do to try to stop it. He did not do this. It was not his place, and sentiment, as he had reminded himself, did not clarify, it only complicated. He went out into Whitmore Lane. The morning was grey and damp and entirely unremarkable, and he stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed the cold air and felt the pleasant, grounding solidity of the stone beneath his excellent shoes. Then he straightened his hat, raised his hand for a cab, and went home. There was a tisane waiting, and a monograph he had been meaning to read for 3 weeks, and a cracked teacup on the kitchen shelf that needed, he had decided, to be repaired rather than discarded. Some things, with care and patience, could still be mended.